Welcome to ProutSpace. Let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Michael Zimmerman, the spiritual name Vanaba. He's a longtime Proutist, a personal friend. He became interested in P.R. Sarkar's economic and social philosophy. So after 35 years in the healthcare finance section, when he retired, he decided to go back to the university to graduate studies in heterodox and ecological economics. His career represents a broad spectrum of healthcare providers with a particular interest in smaller community-based health systems. He's presented nationally, internationally, including in Beijing, China, and Singaraja, Bali, that I've been to personally. Michael is a board member of the Prout Research Institute of Asheville, North Carolina. He's presenting today about problems with neoclassical economics market system. Wants to explore the neoclassical economic model of a perfectly competitive market, challenging the foundational assumptions of the model and questioning whether it's logical, whether it's designed to adhere to the internal logic of neoclassical economics. Given the conclusions reached, he'll ask whether Prout could provide an alternative system. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Michael Zimmerman.
Namaskar. Thank you, Dada, for that introduction. First, I would like to thank Proutist Universal and the principals involved and for the invitation. Appreciate Dada putting my name forward to have some interest in making a presentation. So what we want to do today is kind of start out with some basics. And by the time we're done with hopefully what will be about 60 minutes, it'll allow time for question and answers. But we're going to jump over 4 classes at the undergraduate level and 2 or 3 classes at the graduate level to get where I hope we can be at the end of that 60 minutes. So first thing I want to do is remind us all what the American humorist Mark Twain said about what we know. It's not what we know that gets us, including me, into trouble. It's what we know for sure. That, as they say in Tennessee, just ain't so. And we find that within neoclassical economics. So starting real quickly with the types of markets within neoclassical economics, and I realize many of you know this because you're Proutist and you're aware of what marginalist neoclassical standard theory says with respect to markets. As an aside, you will hear me using those 3 phrases interchangeably: standard theory of economics, neoclassical economics, marginal economics. We'll use those interchangeably. So in the types of markets, we have perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and we are going to focus on perfect competition, and we will be making a comparison later in the program to monopoly. So we have to first understand is, what do neoclassicalists mean by competition? Before we do that, I want to maybe plant some seeds, some assertions and questions to consider, because we will revisit this at the end of the presentation with some answers. What is price in the neoclassical model? Is the neoclassical notion of, quote, allocative efficiency reasonable? To what length will neoclassical econ go to maintain their market ideology? And was it ever challenged? Was that model ever challenged by academic scholars? And as I say, were there exit ramps that could have been taken, but were not? Were markets always the best way to allocate resources? And lastly, should standard econ theory, neoclassical, be considered a science? So within neoclassical marginalist economics, there are certain assertions that are gospel, they're axiomatic, can't be challenged. One of them is that price is set where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Except for monopoly. A monopolist is what's called a price setter. I think we all understand that. They can dictate price because they control the quantity of whatever product is being supplied in the market. Please remember this. We're going to come back to it. Remember this comment about monopolists being price setters also. Where did this canon, where did this dogma, to use the word, where did it originate? It originated in what's called the diamond water paradox. It was posed by Adam Smith in his seminal treatise, The Wealth of Nations. And through that arose this idea of the marginal unit. The water diamond paradox simply asks the question, why are diamonds, which are generally useless, they're pretty, but they're useless, why are they more expensive than water when without water we cannot survive? And this paradoxical question that vexed Adam Smith, he could not answer it. It was answered by the marginalists, this small group of economists in the mid to late 18th century that were using the new, relatively new differential calculus. And what they posed is that consumers are not choosing between all diamonds and all the water in the world. What they're choosing between is one diamond and the last additional unit of water. Just one additional diamond and one additional unit of water. And out of this arose the concept of the marginal unit that permeates neoclassical economics. You see it again and again and again, the word marginal. What is meant by marginal? It's in its simplest term, using calculus, it's the first derivative. It's the first derivative of cost. It's the first derivative of revenue to come up with marginal revenue, marginal cost. This is critical to the neoclassicalists. Out of this came value in use, or exchange value. What they did is they combined subjective valuation with this concept of marginal utility. You see it arising in consumer theory, marginal productivity, this concept in utility is the additional satisfaction a consumer obtains by consuming one more good, one more unit, pizzas and a beer, guns and butter, one more additional unit. So we're going to do something in a minute that presenters are always warned against doing, which is showing a graph. But to understand this concept, we need to show one graph, pick it apart, decompose it, and that starts answering these questions about whether perfect competition represents the real world. So within perfect competition, it has certain attributes. It's a model, and the model has certain rules. So for this model to work within the neoclassical context, is the product has to be homogeneous. All widgets must be essentially the same. That's why neoclassicalists like to talk about agricultural markets, wheat and corn. Can't really tell one wheat berry from another corn kernel from another. Second is that all firms have to have one primary motive, profit maximization. Number three, there's free entry into and out of the market. And under perfect competition, the firm is a price taker, unlike a monopolist. It's the market that sets the price, not the firm. And we will challenge that as we move further into the presentation. Under perfect competition, the firm's a price taker, and because of that, the firm doesn't have to concern itself with the preferences of consumers. All products are essentially the same, whether you're talking about agricultural products, as we said, or whether we're talking about toothbrushes. Toothbrushes are essentially indistinguishable. And lastly, consumers really have no preferences. One wheat berry is the same as the next. One toothbrush is similar to all others. All right, so we're going to start with a standard perfect competition graph. You go to the internet, you look up perfect competition, you will see something like this. You go to any introductory economics textbook and turn to the page of perfect competition, it will look something like this. So to spend a little time here, we have a horizontal line and we have a couple curves. The first curve in blue is marginal cost, and in red is ATC, average total cost. The MC line, marginal cost, is the first derivative of the average total cost. We have a horizontal line. And over on the right-hand side, down towards the bottom, we have a little key of what those abbreviations are. Demand is revenue equals average revenue equals marginal revenue. So does this make reasonable sense? Within neoclassical economics, it does, but does it really? In the curved lines, the reason they're curved is this concept of diminishing returns that I'm sure all of you, many of you are familiar with. Does that really hold in an industrial driven economy? We're going to explore that in a little bit. The issue of diminishing returns is similar to, I can think of my household at the holidays. We have family and friends over, everybody's in the kitchen. 2 or 3 people in the kitchen is fine. But if we have 10 or 20 people in the kitchen, too many cooks in the kitchen, neoclassical economics says that your returns, your efficiency diminishes. Does that hold in an industrial-based setting? It's a rhetorical question. We're going to come back to that in a little while. The next thing that we want to examine is this concept of the horizontal line. It is a perfectly elastic demand curve. And what do we mean by elastic? Go to the internet, you look up elasticity, and you'll see graphs something like this. Perfectly elastic curve is horizontal. And the description given to that is generally luxury goods. If the price changes, then people may not purchase the luxury vehicle, the luxury product. While on the right-hand side, we have a perfectly inelastic demand. The example given to that most frequently is a classic example of life-saving drugs, insulin. No matter how high the price goes, people have to have their insulin or they will die. So look at the top of that graph. Price elasticity of demand. It's the change in demand divided by a change in price. Divided by a change in price. What if the price doesn't change? So thinking of simple algebra, calculation of slope, rise over run, you're dividing by 0. Somebody forgot their elementary school math. Having a perfectly horizontal demand curve, perfectly out to 10,000 digits to the right of the decimal. It's impossible. And swinging back to the 2 curved lines, this idea of increasing costs, it's a holdover from the pastoral period. It's a holdover from an agricultural economy. It's a holdover from the classics, David Ricardo, and the perceptions about putting the most best tillable agricultural land into production. And if we need more corn, we need more wheat, well, you start putting less fertile land into production. This idea of the increasing cost, it's a holdover from that time period. So what happens if we make adjustments for those? We make adjustments for those 2 issues. We get a completely different graph. We get a graph where the demand curve is downward sloping. Because demand is downward sloping, marginal revenue then would also be downward sloping. It's the first derivative. Marginal cost is horizontal because total cost, total average cost is horizontal. There's no variable associated with it. It's taking the first derivative of an equation that's a constant. It's got to be a constant. So we begin to have a completely different graph than what's represented by neoclassical economics. Where's marginal revenue and marginal cost? It's right there. Where's price? Price is greater than marginal cost. But wait a minute. We're starting to violate the rules of this neoclassical model, where price is always set at marginal revenue equals marginal cost, except for monopolies. So as the graph says, I've kind of already touched on that. This is beginning to look similar to a monopoly market structure according to neoclassical economics. And so if you go to the internet, you take a look at a monopolist market graph, you'll see something like this. The monopolist doesn't price where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It prices up to demand. It prices up to what consumers are willing to buy, and that is controlled by the monopolists. In a monopoly market, price is greater than the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. So these are deep, flawed assumptions. And I want to reference a paper from 1957. This is by George Stigler. It was at the University of Chicago and also Cornell. Small, as he noted in this paper, does not mean zero. It means the slope of the individual's demand curve is not horizontal. This has been known for 67 years. Yet perfect competition is still taught as fact in university. So George Stigler also said something else that we're not really going to dwell on. I'm going to mention it, but he talks about the chain rule within calculus. You take 100 individual firms all producing similar products. Because of the chain rule, it's virtually impossible to add all those up into an aggregated market-wide structure or graph, if you will. And this has been known for 67 years, but yet neoclassical economics doubles down and says, this is kind of the preferred market. This is the ideal market, and it's what they compare other market structures to. So we're going to talk about flawed assumption number 2. Whoops. And it's the cost structure. The average total cost curve is not decreasing as more products, or as we all like to say, widgets, are produced. Therefore, the marginal cost is not decreasing either. Nor do the cost curves flip up at the end, showing the effects of diminishing returns. Cost curve is actually constant. So the marginal costs are constant also. And as I've said earlier, this goes back to the classics, David Ricardo, and agricultural production. Industrial production is different. Plant is constructed beyond normal operating capacity. It gets the nameplate productive capacity is always more than where it operates. So let's go back to this graph, because you may be thinking, okay, Mike, that sounds interesting. Where's the proof of this? And there was a another paper, this one written back in 1952, published in 1952. That's older than I am, older than many of us here on this Zoom session. It was published by Ettman and Guthrie. They sent a query out to 1,000 firms, and they got 336 responses back. And they sent in the paper 8 different curves, and you see them there on the right. And they ask an executive or somebody that would know, what is the firm's cost structure? Which of these does it look like? And if the responses adhered to neoclassical theory, marginal revenue, marginal costs, flipping up, they would have chosen graphs 3, 4, and 5. But when we look at 3, 4, and 5, only 5% of the respondents, 5.4% of the respondents chose those. They chose 6 and 7, which is about 95%. So what these respondents are saying is that they do not, their cost structures and therefore their pricing structures do not adhere to neoclassical theory. This is significant. And one of the professors I had in grad school was following up with this with his own query to firms. There's another issue within neoclassical economics as we zoom through 4 undergraduate courses and multiple graduate level courses, is this idea of allocative efficiency, where the market is always the best way to deliver products to consumers. Allocative efficiency basically says you can read it where marginal cost is close as possible to marginal benefits. Marginal benefits are defined as, demand, that marginal demand. But this only works when we consider the productivity possibilities frontier, which is based on full employment and full output. And when does an advanced industrial society operate at full employment and full output? Generally, they do not. So this idea of allocative efficiency only works at full employment, full output, where the intersection of that graph on the right is along that slope curve on the left. And in this example, points B, D, C, it only functions, this neoclassical theory only holds at full employment, full output. In 1932, Burl and Means had a, quote, famous book. Their primary observation was that large corporations had become separated from the control. And the control was held by this cadre of professional managers. Everybody recognizes that these days. This isn't controversial stuff. But there is another observation they made that's not as well known, and that was with regard to administrative pricing, what they called administrative pricing. Now, let's keep bearing in mind, this was 92 years ago that these made these observations. Administrative pricing is based on the internal pricing structure of the firms, taking into full costs. They're saying prices are not set through market forces of supply and demand. They are set by internal costs administratively, not intersecting marginal revenue and marginal cost. There's another old 1952. This was a book, not a paper, that also provided an off-ramp, if we will, for neoclassicalists to start considering certain weaknesses in their theories. This is John Kenneth Galbraith. His idea of countervailing power of capital over labor. This idea perpetuates a false narrative. And the narrative is capital is basically more important than labor, and labor gets what it deserves. Labor gets its just deserts, and it's the concept of marginal productivity theory. Again, marginal. This idea of marginal, the first derivative. It permeates neoclassical economics. And as an aside, we should know, going back to Burrell and Means, is that they were not neoclassical economists. They were institutionalists in the tradition of Thornton, Veblen, John Commons, and Wesley Mitchell. As we know, Kenneth Galbraith was also. He was a heterodox economist. There we go. So as we kind of move forward, what are some of the implications of this as we've picked apart this graph? Under perfect competition, when we make those adjustments for those flawed, some people would say heroic assumptions, that price is not set at marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Price is set above marginal cost, just like in a monopoly. So if it's set just like in a monopoly, why should we prefer perfect competition over a monopoly market structure? And the implications is that in perfect competition, the firm is actually a price setter, just like in a monopoly. They do not take the, quote, market price. They do consider their internal cost structure. The standard theory, axiomatic canon of allocative efficiency dictates that price is set at marginal cost. I'm repeating and repeating this. The reality is that it does not. In reality, a perfectly competitive market can produce outcomes similar to monopolies with respect to price. And we get to this concept that this structure supports the idea of the mobility of capital. What's the proudest alternative? We all know the three-tiered economy: small-scale businesses, privately owned, medium, through cooperative systems, large or managed by the immediate government. And the focus isn't on profit for profit's sake. As you remember, that was one of the key narratives within the perfectly competitive market. Anyway, this proudest alternative is not possible within a capitalist framework. And now we're moving from undergraduate through, graduate into you're writing your dissertation now. And why is that? Because the three-tiered economy starts disrupting the mobility of capital, disrupts capital formation. It disrupts the social space for firms to maintain or sustain themselves, the concept of antitrust. And it leads to a revisioning of the social provisioning process, how each of us sustain and maintain ourselves and our family. Classical economics was all the various classical economists believed in a version of the labor theory, of labor value theory. Neoclassical economists using the relatively new calculus that was developed in the 1600s, the first derivative, they started trying to make economics a little bit more, quote, scientific. I think all of us would agree that that pretty well failed. This idea of social provisioning, it touches upon cultural values, norms, social institutions, political discourse. It also touches upon ecological systems upon which all of us are dependent upon. This revisioning, it has to touch upon common dualisms that we're familiar with. In neoclassical economics, the famous positive versus normative narrative, socioeconomic, micro, macro economics, all these divisions. And if you look back at, Smith, the so-called father of, capitalism, what he did was create this bifurcation between economics and every other aspect of human engagement, religious, spiritual, capitalism. The primacy of capital trumped all those other more socially problematic narratives. So as we start drilling down, as we've done, and picking apart a model, I chose the perfectly competitive model when Dot asked if I'd be interested in making a presentation. It leads to an understanding that neoclassical econ gets many things wrong. That some people, as Mark Twain said, it's not what you know, it's what you don't know, gets people in trouble. If we make a short list of what neoclassical econ gets wrong, some of their definitions of inflation, money, how interest rates are determined, they are not determined in the loanable funds market theory. It's just wrong. They also got labor market wrong. And that's one we all know about. Keynes showed that employment is determined by the point of effective demand. The ISLM representation is wrong. Investment saving liquidity preference of demand is not wrong, but you see it rising everywhere um, notable economists. You also see it in even in certain Prout discourses. Deficits are bad. Carte blanche, deficits are bad. That's the ISLM representation. Paul Krugman used to cotton to that idea. Then we can move on to the basic concept of supply and demand. When we get the gist of what's wrong with the perfectly competitive market, we start getting a glimmer of basic supply and demand, the intersecting supply and demand curves that we've all seen since, college, high school. The idea of equilibrium with regard to certain commodities, it's wrong. The dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, it's wrong. It's dependent upon the benevolent dictator to make it work. And that, thank you to economist PhD Steve King for that. That flowed out of his work. So this acknowledges that neoclassical economics is not able to provide a description that fits the real world. It was not able to describe what happened back in the global Great Recession of 2007, 8, 9, 10. There are different ways of approaching that, and I chose to approach it through the deficiency of the perfectly competitive market. So these questions and assertions that we posed early in the presentation, what's the price of neoclassical economic model? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We know it doesn't. Is the neoclassical notion of allocative efficiency reasonable? No. It only works under certain conditions. Those conditions are full employment, full output. To what length will standard econ go to maintain this market ideology? Extraordinary. And was this concept ever challenged by academic scholars? Were there exit ramps over the generations and decades? Yeah, there were, but to no avail. Those that hold the power of academic econ double down, and they slightly tweak their axiomatic model and then move forward and basically keep that model. In this case, we're talking about the market model, perfect competition. Markets are always the best way to allocate resources, everywhere and always. And we know that's a no. And should standard econ theory be considered a science? Hardly. No, not when considering the totality of everything it gets wrong that we just kind of walk through. So we're coming to the very end of the presentation, and we'll open to question and answers. I see at least one hand raised there. So question to ask is, did neoclassical economics ever provide anything of use? This idea of marginal? Yeah, it helped answer that question in respect to the diamond water paradox. It offered some solutions in World War II regarding supply and maximization, minimization models of munitions. But it fails to answer certain contemporary questions. It didn't answer the questions. It didn't predict the great financial crisis. And it needs to be adjusted and replaced. So that concludes my comments. I'm ending a little bit early. So thank you very much. And we'll open to questions.
Thank you. Brother Jagat, would you like to be first?
Thank you. Yes, I would. I have, I don't think I have questions. I think I have comments, if I may make a few.
Please, Jagabandhu. Namaskar. Welcome.
Namaskar. Thank you. First of all, thank you. That was, you obviously put a lot of work into your presentation, so thank you for that. And I have to say, I certainly agree with the assertion that whatever the socioeconomic question, Prout is clearly the answer. So I agree with you on that part. I have to strongly disagree with you about everything you have to say about neoclassical economics. I don't think you understand what neoclassical economists are doing. Everything you said was graduate level is covered in about the first 4 weeks of introductory microeconomics. I've taught microeconomics at 5 different universities. I cover all that stuff in the first 4 weeks, and I make it clear to my students it's not true. It's just a stylized model, and nobody believes it that I know of. Nobody believes in perfect competition. Nobody believes any of that stuff to be true. In the same way, when you take an introductory physics course, you start off with models where you assume there's no friction and no gravity to make everything simple. And then as you go on, you introduce things like monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. The graph you drew that you said was a deconstruction of the perfectly competitive model was simply a graph of monopolistic competition. Standard graph, we always draw it. Public economics is one of my fields. The initial assumption in public economics is that markets do not work. They do not allocate efficiently. I introduced that in Econ 101. I introduced allocated inefficiency right from the start. All of my Econ 101 students know that markets do not allocate resources efficiently. They know that labor markets do not work. And every so-called neoclassical economist I know teaches like that. I don't know any of them who believe the things that you seem to think we believe. Honestly, I think if you look at people who have been winning the Nobel lately, like Esther Duflo, David Card, some of these people, you'll see that the kind of people that are doing work now in mainstream economics are not making the assumptions you seem to think they're making. And again, the stuff you're saying is graduate level economics is Econ 101, every bit of it. Now, on the macro side, I'll leave that up to my Atita. He's more a macro person, but I'm just telling you what's going on the micro side. It's your criticism of the perfectly competitive model is exactly right. The problem is everybody knows it's right, and everybody agrees with you, and no one teaches it that way.
Okay, I appreciate those comments. To make a response, you mentioned that it was Andy Card.
David Card.
David Card, who did the work on fast food restaurants and
he did the work. He showed that raising the minimum wage can actually increase employment. It was an empirical study he did with
Right. So out of the neoclassical narrative, he faced, how to say, stiff, some would say vicious opposition to that.
And yet he won a Nobel Prize and the John Bates Clark Medal, which are the two biggest prizes in economics.
Right. But you can go online and you can see this this pushback.
But a lot of that pushback, I apologize for interrupting you. A lot of that pushback is political, not theoretical. Let's face it, the political argument for the perfectly competitive market will always be there because it benefits corporations and big business. But the theoretical argument is less potent these days.
So it perpetuates what many people who don't take economics, some people that never take your 101 econ, that never get to graduate, it perpetuates that political narrative.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying
this idea that marginalism has the answer.
Honestly, I'm going to fight you on that. I think marginalism is not a bad way to understand individual decision making. I understand your training was different than mine, and that's cool. But I'm just saying, I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think it's like any kind of tool. It depends on how you apply it and what your underlying assumptions are going in.
It's a tool that has its place.
Yes, exactly.
In the graduate program I went through, it was an institutionalist program.
Understood.
Famous saying, why should we use a wrench when we need a hammer?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. But
marginalism has all the answers.
Well, it doesn't have all the answers, but it has a lot more answers than I think you're giving it credit for. The program I went through was reasonably progressive and leftist relative to most neoclassical programs. And it was still very much neoclassical based because if you apply these tools correctly, you can even use them. You can apply them to Prout. But that's a whole other set of debates. My point is, I think you've set up kind of a straw man here using a very old, very basic understanding of neoclassical that doesn't really apply to most. I mean, you're stating this as if this is what's going on in college classrooms, and it probably is at some colleges, but not at most of them.
Fair. Okay. Fair. You mentioned CARD. So there's this narrative, this story about Kruger, who worked on that paper with him, who committed suicide.
Yes.
There's this, at least one narrative I have heard, is that to use a word, vicious blowback was one of the reasons that he took his own life.
I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't think we should necessarily assume that unless we know for sure.
Not assuming, it was out there on the internet.
Honestly, if I may say, there's nothing that cannot be found on the internet.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Yes.
I just I don't see that as particularly relevant to what we're talking about now.
I see it relevant to the political dynamic that you brought up. That
no, okay, fine. Anyway, I see you're wedded to what you want to believe, and that's fine. So I will yield to whoever else wants to speak. I yield the floor to the next speaker.
Are there other questions or comments?
There are some comments.
Please.
There is a question in the chat from Sam Monroe. So the question is, How does Prout conjugate the intersectionality of these factors into a gyroscopic equilibrium?
As I interpret what Baba is giving us back with the three-tiered economy, is that the economy's broken into, as we all know, three major categories. No one of those categories has a dominant control. Small scale businesses would price, as we know, within administrative pricing, not according to the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Where does the intersection of supply and demand meet? It's a great question. And I think to answer that, we need to consider ecological economics. Within ecological economics, they challenge the concept of the supply and demand, the equilibrium, the point of equilibrium for particularly for scarce natural resources. I think those would be provided according to the intermediate government on some schedule that provides reserving some of those resources for future generations, and particularly for global South countries. That's a great question. I see that Mayatita has his hand up. Namaskar, brother. Mayatita?
There we are. Namaskar, and
Mayatita.
thank you. I just want to add a brief comment. Yeah, my economics training has been a little bit of both of what you and Jagat Bandhu experienced. So I'm a bit eclectic. I'm maybe somewhere in the middle here. So I think both of you are on point in some way, although I do agree with Jagat, the thrust of what Jagat Bandhu was saying. I think a proudest economy will be using conventional economic techniques. Some marginalism will certainly be useful in determination of how to allocate resources. But we'll certainly go beyond the narrow kinds of what I think rather than neoclassical economics, we might call market fundamentalism. But my suggestion is maybe take a look at the work of Yaroslav Vanyak. Perhaps you and others here already have. He wrote the general theory of the labor managed economies, and what he did was really use neoclassical methodology to essentially mathematically prove the superiority of a cooperatively based economy over a conventional capitalist economy, that it's more efficient productively and allocatively, and then goes beyond those calculations with additional arguments that how cooperatives will be more socially beneficial as well. So again, not only do you need to use the right tool, but you need to use the tools that we have for the right purpose. And that makes all the difference as well.
Thank you.
Excuse me real quickly. Mayatita, could you type his name and the title of his book in the notes, please?
Here we go.
I know that Proudus contacted him, Jaroslav Vanek, many years ago. And he was very sympathetic to Prout. From Eastern Europe, and his work is, of course, all about cooperatives.
May I say one more thing?
Yes.
Thank you. I was not going to bring this up because it goes back to 2010, but since we've been quoting things all the way back to 1930 something, I think this is relevant. There was a nice article in the American Economic Review, which if those of you not in the know, that's the premier economics journal for mainstream economics in 2010 by some environmental economists showing that they did some empirical work on 5 industries showing that the cost to society of their pollution was greater than their output value. So that if we correctly value the cost of their pollution, these 5 industries should not even exist. The worst of them was coal-fired electricity. The second worst was concrete. This was using standard neoclassical economic tools and econometrics. Very nice application of these tools and a very nice result. Of course, naturally, these industries are still out there polluting because we don't internalize externalities. But I thought that was a really nice piece of work. And as I said, it was published in the premier journal in economics. It's hard to overstate the importance of the American Economic Review.
Jagad, can we ask you to type that into the chat too, please?
Yeah, you may not be able to find that online if you don't have access
But that's
to
okay.
the.
Just go ahead and type it in.
Yeah, I'm going to have to
Thank
look
you.
it up, but I'll
Thank
get
you.
back to you.
Thank you.
Any other comments, suggestions?
Namaskar. May I?
Please.
Okay. Well, I'm not so well versed in all this deep in classic economics.
Can you please introduce yourself first?
Yes, sir. I am a Locadeva from Brazil, currently living in United States, in Virginia. As I was saying, I'm not so well versed in classic economics. As my study field in undergraduate was social science, anthropology, I had few oh Baba. Okay, I'll start my video. few studies in solidarity economy back in Brazil. And I'm curious because my feeling hearing you all is there is so much focus in the two aspects for the quadrate dimensional economy, general economy and commercial economy. And I feel a little bit trapped in those kinds of thoughts when we are not trying to put so much effort in the popular economy. I don't know how this neoclassic economy sees the popular economy, and I became curious to hear about it. If you can.
I think you mean Prout's People's Economy, what they call People's Economy in English.
Sorry, bad translation back
Yeah.
from Portuguese to English.
Yeah.
Hmm. You know, in Bob's discourses, that's where I derive a lot of inspiration. Economic democracy, decentralized economy. There are a number of points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I try and think, how can we see those in given the current socioeconomic milieu, United States, where we can't even agree on certain facts in our political discourse. That becomes pretty problematic for me as I try and think through how those would be actualized. And then I get to the point of keep reminding myself that much of what Baba gave us, it's not possible within a capitalist framework. This three-tiered economy, it's not possible within a capitalist framework. And then I start thinking about, what Baba gave us. What type of knowledge did Baba give us? Para, apara, guru's knowledge, para, mundane knowledge, apara, textbook knowledge. A lot of what I've spent time trying to understand in my career and post-career and graduate school is book knowledge. It's this apara knowledge. Neoclassical alternatives, heterodox, what's taught, what's not taught, how do people become influenced by bad ideas, bad thoughts, from how to say old dead white guys, old dead white men. And I keep coming back to book knowledge versus guru's knowledge, the last two vrittis, and how we, pierce through that. For me, it's a dialogue. It's a work in process. For me, wrapped around some general principles or guidelines that Baba, my guru, gave all of us, is trying to understand how that will happen. And there's part of me that rarely talks about this. I don't think it may happen until crisis. And I think we can see many crises surrounding us. Crises, political crises, social crises, economic crises. I mean, there's an old narrative that when Dr. Ravi Batra, someone gave Baba a copy of his old book, The Great Depression, Baba was like, yes, very nice, very nice. But Dr. Batra, tell him he needs to be writing on social issues. Of which the narrative I heard, Dr. Batra said, but that's not my specialty. I'm paraphrasing. I write within the field of economics. Part of what I have tried to understand is why we didn't have a Great Depression of 1990. And in the emails I've had with Dr. Batra, he kind of answers that. But we can also look at what Dr. Batra said at the December 2020 Neo-Humanistic Solutions Conference sponsored by POB. He answers that question. We can look at what he said at the Ananda Marga Incorporated AMPS retreat in December of 2021. He answers that question. We can look at what he wrote in his Common Sense Economics, particularly chapter 13. And he begins to answer that question. So for me, it's looking at what a lot of esteemed scholars have opined, what they've said over the years. And when they come back and they say, well, it wasn't quite that. I have a tendency to look and pay attention to that and see if it can provide me guidance with respect to these issues that Baba left us. It leads me to look at Baba's 1959 discourse, where he steps right up to the line of talking about the physics of the first and second principles of thermodynamics. And I didn't know that a couple of years ago. Now I do. I think part of the solution of what we're talking about, where we find equilibrium, it's got to involve the biosphere. Whereas Baba says, it's like we're signing our death knell. So how do we loop that into economics? For me, part of it is I'm an old guy, maybe not as old as some of you. I'll be 69 this year, is casting off what I learned back in the 70s. And what I learned at university was marginalism, neoclassical. And through my career in healthcare finance, talking to executives, that's what they understood. Now, they're not economists, but they're executives working with state representatives, state senators, who also had that background. Marginalism, it's had its time in the sun. It can provide certain answers. It's a hammer. It's a tool. But sometimes we need a wrench. Sometimes we need a saw. And that's what I was trying to attempt to do today, is draw attention to that, and then try and wrap Prout's alternative around that, which I don't believe can be implemented within the capitalist framework because it's disruptive to so much of what capitalism, particularly the United States flavor, is based on: the primacy of capital, the mobility of capital, capital held and accumulated and aggregated by capitalists. Also, who has access to money? Who has access to the money thing? What is the money thing? So these are the questions that, I don't know, to make a joke, wake people up in the middle of the night, and you try and answer, for me, around the guidance that I see that Baba gave us. The issue of looping incorporated biosphere into economics is critical. I am one class away from completing a certificate in formal study in ecological economics. You know, calculating the alternative to GDP. It's escaping me right now. And when you compare that to GDP, like we're in deep doo-doo. We're in deep difficulty. We're using resources,
Excuse me, can
but
you,
calling them income. I'm sorry, Dada.
can you share with us what Ravi Butler's response was?
With respect to,
You said you wrote to him, you said that he
oh,
gave his response in this article and in this
thank
book.
you. Thank you. So in December of 2000, Dr. Batra made a presentation, Neo-Humanistic Solutions. He answered a question from the audience. Dr. Batra, when do you think we'll have the next depression? Dr. Batra responds and says, I don't think we'll have another depression. Economists have figured out how to keep that from happening. That's virtually a quote. Several months
Big
go
change
by,
from his book, The Great Depression of 1990.
isn't it? Isn't it? Several months go by and I'm thinking about that and I'm thinking about it. It's a burr under my saddle, so to say. And I find his email address and I reach out to him and I ask him, what did you mean? I studied here, got my MA to help me understand some things Baba said better. And so he knew where I went to grad school, UMKC in Kansas City. He knows what that means. He knows who teaches there. And he says, you know, I used to think that depression could only happen of a 1929 variety. But consultants to presidents have figured out how to keep that, you know, from happening by issuing debt. And then he goes on and tells me a story. And I respond back and I tell him a story about who his story was about the consultant to the White House that told the White House how money really works, debits and credits, of which you will see in his chapter 13 of his Common Sense Economics. He basically, to say Dr. Batra embraces the principal essence findings of the scholars that I trained under would be a bit much. I wouldn't say he embraces that, but he acknowledges it. He acknowledged it in those public statements. He acknowledges it in chapter 13 of his Common Sense Economics. But I think that's a beginning, because those economists, some of them don't appreciate the effect on the biosphere and the decisions that we've been making that is leading to a global crisis. I think that's a beginning. For me, to hear Dr. Batra almost do a 180 on these issues gives me, one, it's an appreciation of how difficult these topics are. That I know what I know, but I may not know something that that other person knows. And instead of mocking and ridiculing, maybe we ought to be open to discussion and seeing what fits. Dr. Batra was trying to pose a theory based on, as I can tell, ISLM, investment saving, liquidity, preference of money. Debt is bad. You know, there's another alternative out there based on the work of Wayne Godley, Mikhail Koleski, Basil Moore. It's about how does money actually work? What do the central banks say how money works? It's debits and credits. And if it's debits and credits, what does that represent? So for me, listening to Dr. Batra say these things was, you know, over a period of a couple of years, my head blew up. So once again, personally, I'm trying to understand the deficiencies within topic of this presentation, neoclassical economics. They are plentiful, including how money actually works. Fractional reserve reporting and the money multiplier, anyone? Money doesn't work that way. That's not how banks finance their balance sheets. Loanable funds theory, it doesn't exist. As I've studied and as I've tried to understand these issues, you know, somebody may misinterpret what I just said over the last couple of minutes about Dr. Batra. I have the utmost respect for him. He has been and remains a hero to many of us, speaking truth, attempting to speak truth to power. If not but for being introduced to economics through Dr. Batra, I may not have done this crazy thing of going to grad school in my 60s. You know, my wife saying, "Why are you doing this?"
Excuse me, James, you made a comment and I'm not sure what it was referring to. Was it referring to something that Mike said or something that the comment written in the chat by Satya? James Killigan? Not here anymore. Okay, so Satya has a comment. I don't understand it. If you understand it, Pranava, you can try to respond.
Satya to everyone, from the simplest organisms to planetary, solar, galactic, and societies. Toroidal flow conjugates progressively functional homeostasis inclusively at every threshold, including worthwhile ideologies operating in temporal realms. I need some help.
Satya, would you like to explain it? So I can't understand it. So let's
Okay. All right.
reply.
So I want to go back to what I was trying to say just a minute ago is I'm not saying Dr. Batra was wrong. What I'm saying is that we are all on an evolutionary growth journey. When I think of it, Baba permitted Ravi to move in a certain a certain direction. Without that direction, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have done my studies. But I'm deeply concerned, as I think we all are, with respect to ecological biosphere impact on the economy. And that's what drove me from studying at UMKC in Kansas City to studying the program out of Australia through Torrance University. The ecological program is ecology of sustainability.
There's another comment from Brad Smith. Can you read that in the chat, Mike?
I had to step out a bit, so something like this may have been said. I think Mike's point may be that the way economics is practiced by those in power is more like market fundamentalism than what may be taught academically. I have never taught academically. I have read those that have taught academically. My my graduate degree was through a heterodox program with many comments about how standard econ is taught. So possibly Maya Tita or Jagat Bandhu would like to, I see Jagat Bandhu's hand up. Jagat Bandhu may like to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that comment's about right. In terms of, I taught academically for about 35 years, and I did not teach as you presented it here, and none of my fellow economists taught that way, as far as I knew. It was very much a real effort to make it clear to students that the perfectly competitive model is not anything any of us believed in, but that it was only presented initially as a simplifying set of assumptions to enable us to focus on certain simple concepts. And then we threw it out as quickly as possible and introduced reality or something closer to reality very quickly. And as I said, the things you talked about as being graduate level were all done in Econ 101. Every graph, every concept you mentioned is all Econ 101 at every school I ever taught at. And I taught at 5 different universities. So that was all Econ 101 for me. And I taught all the way up to PhD level micro. But all that stuff was Econ 101 for me. But it is true that, particularly on the right wing, politicians like to believe in or act like they believe in free markets until it hurts their own constituents. And then they will be happy to mess with the market in any way they can to enable their constituents to get what they want. So they only believe in free markets up to the point that it's helpful to their constituents. And then they are very happy to mess with markets in any way they can to help their own constituents and their own donors. So free market orthodoxy is nonsense, and everybody knows it's nonsense, but they will use it as a talking point to the extent it is helpful to try and get a bill passed. But it's more so on the right side of the political spectrum than on the left, but it's definitely used by anybody who thinks they can get away with it to make a political point. But in academia, by and large, at least no university I've been at, with one exception, I taught for a little while at Marquette. The chair of the department was a very sweet guy, but he went to school at George Mason. He was very right wing. He did actually pretty much buy into a lot of the right wing stuff. But apart from him, most of the economists I've known did not. So that's my little spiel about what I think goes on, at least in the classroom.
Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments?
Our time is up now.
I see John.
So, yep.
Like
ahead,
to hear
John.
I would like to hear what he has to say. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, many of us aren't terribly inclined to quote Milton Friedman. But one quote that I've always appreciated is his fairly well-known one about, change and crises, and sort of the comment that he makes about the role that he saw, for himself and the Chicago boys, or the real conservative folks, was to their job was to create alternatives and keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the inevitable. And so I wonder if that's, I think that's the way some of us are starting to see a lot of the work we're doing in terms of Prout, as trying to build those alternatives. And as you pointed out, there's a clear trending toward catastrophic crises, from an environmental standpoint, among a few others. And so, I think one of the previous presenters, Govinda, kind of touched on this point about, when capitalism's ascendant, it's not an opportune moment to try and create, alternatives to it, but it is now increasingly in crisis. And so is that our job as people, engaged in Prout, to be building the alternatives, and one of the fundamental things I think many of us have recognized in Prout is there's sort of a broad overview, but some of the really pragmatic aspects of how do you implement, a Prout-based economy is a challenge. And I think some of us are trying to invest some time and effort in what does that really look like. So I'd just be curious, is that kind of how you see it? I mean, I really appreciated your presentation. I thought it was excellent.
Thank you. Keeping the name of Prout out there amongst a certain constituency, amongst certain people. I know there's discussions from time to time of creating an alternate party around Proutish principles. Other countries, Dot in Germany, I think is having some success with that. But here in the U.S., I have deep concerns about doing something like that now. I think the best that we can do, wrong phraseology, is that we keep talking, we keep presenting, we keep, these thoughts and ideas that Sakar gave us out there. We discuss them amongst ourselves, and at some point, they'll take traction. Maybe not in the way that we think, maybe not in, my lifetime. I've turned into, an old guy here, raising a family, having a career, being married to the same woman. I'm trying to answer, questions that frankly were eluding me. I think frequently change comes with crisis. So we need to keep out there, keep these ideas going. I will say one thing, and maybe close with this. Some of this stuff I read, some of the best ideas are coming out of women. There was an article not too long ago naming, the 5 women that are naming, changing the male-dominated, misogynistic, econ. Go to econ Twitter and you'll see it. To that published list, there are other women. Claudia Schramm, that has some really interesting ideas. We need more women participating in economics. We need more women participating within, PRI. I'm not a member of the PA, so I can, speak to PRI. Some of the best stuff is originating with women. So with that, I don't know if anybody else has any other comments, or if Dada, you want to close the program.
It's time to close. Thank you very much, everyone.
Right. Namaskar. Thank you for the
Appreciate it.
opportunity.